Go find a mirror right now. If the eyes looking back at you are green, you are carrying one of the rarest physical traits found anywhere on this planet. It is rarer than being a lefty, rarer than natural red hair. Walk down a busy street and count 100 faces, and only about 2 of them will share your exact eye color. For thousands of years, nobody had a real answer for why. People blamed spirits, noble bloodlines, and curses passed down through unlucky marriages. Almost nobody landed anywhere close to the truth. Only in the last few decades have scientists actually cracked the code, and the answer points somewhere far older and stranger than most people would guess, a trail that winds all the way across the Asian continent. Before we dig in, if you have green eyes yourself, or you love someone who does, tap that subscribe button. This channel uncovers the hidden stories locked inside human DNA, the kind of details a home ancestry kit will never tell you. Now let's get into where green eyes truly come from. Let's start with the numbers, because they are almost hard to believe once you see them written out. Brown eyes dominate the globe. Something close to 3/4 of every human being alive has them, and in many regions, that number climbs even higher. Blue eyes are the well-known minority, heavily concentrated across northern parts of Europe, but scattered thinly almost everywhere else on Earth. Green, though, sits in a category all by itself. Across most worldwide surveys, green eyes turn up in somewhere around 2 out of every 100 people. In plenty of countries, you could spend your whole life there and never once meet a stranger with green eyes. That extreme rarity is exactly why the old legends never stopped growing. When a trait is uncommon enough, people stop trying to understand it and start inventing stories about it instead. Across ancient cultures, green eyes were treated as something eerie and rarely in a kind way. In parts of medieval Europe, a green-eyed woman risked being whispered about as a witch, simply because anything unusual drew suspicion. Elsewhere, green got tangled up with jealousy, which is exactly why we still call envy the green-eyed monster today. Travelers who met green-eyed people in distant lands wrote about them as though they had stumbled on something not quite human. That was the best explanation anyone had for centuries. It took the arrival of modern genetics to finally clear that fog away and hand us something far more astonishing than any old legend ever invented. It also helps to know where green eyes actually cluster, because they are not scattered evenly across the map. The heaviest concentrations sit in the northern and western corners of Europe. In Ireland and Scotland, green eyes appear at rates dramatically above the global average. Travel across the rest of Europe and that number thins out, and by the time you reach East Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, or the Americas, green eyes become almost non-existent. That uneven spread is not an accident. It is a genetic footprint, a record of where an ancient mutation for light-colored eyes traveled, took root, and blended with every population it touched. Your eye color, in a strange way, is a quiet record of human movement written into the faces of billions of people. Now here's the part that is going to rearrange how you think about your own eyes. Green eyes are not actually green. There is no green pigment sitting inside a human iris, none whatsoever. If you took a green-colored iris apart under a microscope and searched for green dye molecules, you would come up completely empty-handed. So how are you seeing green when you look in the mirror? The answer is one of the strangest tricks biology has ever pulled off, and once you understand it, your own reflection will never look quite the same. It all comes down to a substance called melanin, the same pigment that colors your skin, your hair, and the outer layer of your iris. Melanin only really comes in shades of brown and black. A heavy dose gives you dark brown eyes. Slightly less, and you land around hazel or amber. When there is very little melanin left, something completely different takes over. The front layer of your iris is a see-through tissue, almost like frosted glass, sitting over a darker backing. When light floods in, it scatters through that hazy layer. The longer wavelengths, the reds and warm yellows, get absorbed by the dark backing underneath. But the shorter blue wavelengths bounce straight back out toward the observer. This is the exact same principle that paints the daytime sky blue, even though the air holds no blue pigment at all. A person with blue eyes is not showing you a blue substance. They are showing you scattered light, the same physics trick that colors the sky above your head every day. Every blue-eyed and green-eyed person on this planet is, in a very real sense, carrying a tiny piece of the sky inside their skull. That scattering effect alone is enough to create blue eyes. So where does green come from? Green is the middle ground. It happens when that same blue scattering effect combines with a thin extra coating of a yellowish pigment called lipochrome. Blue light scattering upward, mixed with a faint golden wash from the lipochrome, and your brain blends the two into what you perceive as green. You are looking at a living optical illusion. A hint of yellow, a scatter of blue, and a precise amount of melanin landing inside a narrow window. Too much, and you tip into brown. Too little, and you end up pure blue. Green only appears when every variable lines up almost exactly right, which is a huge reason it stays so rare. This is the key difference between blue and green that almost nobody realizes. Blue is essentially the result of something missing, close to the default outcome once melanin drops low enough. Green asks for far more, that same low pigment starting point, plus the dusting of golden lipochrome, plus melanin production, stopping at an exact halfway mark instead of dropping to almost nothing. Blue is a single ingredient. Green is a full recipe that has to be followed almost perfectly every time. Which brings us to the real question. If green eyes depend on such a fragile balancing act, why do some people end up with them while most people never do? The answer is written into your DNA, tucked inside a stretch of genetic code that hardly anyone outside of science has ever heard of. Buried inside your chromosomes sits a small region researchers have studied intensely for roughly 2 decades. 2 genes do most of the work. The first, OCA2, acts like the body's melanin production plant, controlling how much pigment gets pumped into the iris. The second, HERC2, is the real star of the story. PRC2 makes no pigment itself. It functions like a dimmer switch sitting right beside OCA2, capable of turning that melanin plant up or down. A tiny alteration inside HERC2 can quietly turn the whole system down, telling the body to produce far less pigment than normal. And when scientists went hunting for the origin of light-colored eyes, this dimmer switch is exactly what they found. Picture what these researchers were actually doing. They combed through genetic code one letter at a time, hunting for the exact spot where light-eyed people differed from dark-eyed ones, across a genome billions of letters long. And once they zeroed in on the region governing eye color, the difference came down to a change so tiny you could scroll right past it, one single tweak inside that dimmer switch, turning pigment production down just enough to change how a person's eyes catch the light. Here's where things get almost impossible to believe. A research group in Copenhagen spent years comparing DNA from light-eyed people in dramatically different corners of the world, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. What they found stopped them cold. Nearly every one of these people carried the exact same microscopic genetic switch, flipped in the exact same location, changed in the exact same way. Not a similar mutation, the identical one, down to the same single letter of DNA. There is really only one honest explanation for that. Every one of these people inherited it from a single shared ancestor. One human being who lived long before anyone was writing anything down. If your eyes carry any light color at all, you are almost certainly carrying a mutation that traces back to one specific person. Someone who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, most likely near the shores of the Black Sea, where Eastern Europe meets Asia. This individual was not royalty. There were no kings or empires back then, just farmers and herders pulling a living out of the soil. But one person among them was born with a small copying error inside their melanin switch, an error that softened the pigment in their eyes. Instead of disappearing, that error spread, traveling through generation after generation, across continents, surviving wars, migrations, and famines, all the way to the person staring back at you in the mirror today. This is not a poetic flourish. It is cold genetic logic. When a mutation shows up independently in many places, it usually looks slightly different each time, because random mutations rarely land on the exact same spot twice. But when it is completely identical everywhere, right down to the letter, the only reasonable conclusion is that it happened once and was passed down to everyone who now carries it. That is the fingerprint of one common ancestor, echoing across 10,000 years and hundreds of generations until it landed on you. We will never know that person's name or whether they were admired or feared for looking different. They left no statue, no written record. Nothing except a quiet signal buried in the genetic code that outlasted every empire that came after them. And yet, every time a green-eyed or blue-eyed baby opens its eyes for the first time, that nameless ancient person is remembered in the only way that truly endures. Not carved in stone, but written into living tissue. Blue eyes are the simpler half of this story, since blue mostly comes down to that one switch. Green is a bit more layered. It requires that same drop in melanin, plus extra ingredients working alongside it. A specific quantity of remaining pigment, the added lipochrome layer, and several genes fine-tuning together. Green did not spring up out of nowhere. It grew directly out of that same original mutation, then got reshaped further as populations mixed, traveled, and adapted to new lands over time. Green eyes, in a way, are a record of motion. What happens when that original Black Sea mutation wandered far from home and mixed with fresh genetics along the way? So where did that journey lead? East, deep into Asia. But first, a question scientists wrestled with for decades. Why did this mutation even survive? A change that lowers pigment does not obviously improve your chances of survival. It will not make you faster or better at finding food. By pure survival logic, light eyes should have faded out as a rare footnote. Instead, they spread across an entire hemisphere. There are a couple of leading theories, and they might both be true at once. The first involves sunlight. As early humans pushed north and east into regions with weaker sun and long, dark winters, lighter features may have traveled together with lighter skin, which helps the body produce vitamin D under low light. Eye color and skin color share overlapping genetic pathways, so lighter eyes could have simply hitched a ride alongside a trait with a real biological advantage. The second theory is more human and more entertaining. Rarity attracts attention. In small communities where nearly everyone had dark eyes, someone with striking light or green eyes stood out and got remembered, and being memorable has always mattered for passing genes forward. The honest truth is probably a mix of both, part biology, part human attraction to the unusual. So now we have the origin story, a single ancestor near the Black Sea, a mutation that softened the pigment in the human eye, and forces that kept it alive long enough to spread. Now let's trace the journey most people have never heard about, because this story does not stay locked inside Europe. It heads the other way entirely. Roughly 5,000 years ago, waves of herding people from the grasslands north of the Black Sea began pushing outward in every direction. These were people who had tamed horses and lived across open plains, carrying their genetics with them like seeds on the wind. Some pushed west into Europe, others turned east and south into Central Asia, along routes that would later become the great trade corridors of the ancient world. They carried their language, tools, herds, and that same light eye mutation, and as they mixed with populations already living there, the mutation began surfacing in places nobody would expect. These steppe travelers were resilient and relentless, expanding generation after generation and steadily passing their genetics forward. Their impact on the modern human family tree is hard to overstate, and huge portions of populations across both Europe and Asia today still carry echoes of that single expansion. The light eye mutation did not creep slowly. It surged forward on horseback, riding one of the most successful population expansions in history. A couple thousand years later, this whole region got threaded together by an enormous trade network known as the Silk Road, a sprawling web of routes linking China to the Mediterranean through the heart of Central Asia. For over 1,000 years, merchants, soldiers, and travelers moved back and forth along it, and wherever people trade goods, they mixed genetics too. Light eyes, once a quirk of the western steppe, worked their way into the mountain valleys and desert oases of Asia and settled there. In a handful of pockets, cut off from the wider world by mountains and distance, that trait became trapped and concentrated, which is exactly how you end up with something extraordinary. Tucked deep into the mountains of northern Pakistan, in a remote region called the Kailash Valley, lives a small community whose appearance stands out sharply from their neighbors. Fair skin, light hair, and remarkably often green or blue eyes. For generations, outsiders had a favorite explanation ready to go, that these were descendants of Alexander the Great's soldiers, who marched east more than 2,000 years ago and never returned home. It is a beautiful legend, and tour guides still repeat it today. Here's the twist. When geneticists finally tested Kailash DNA, that romantic legend mostly collapsed. The real story turned out to be far older than Alexander. The Kailash are not leftover descendants of a Greek army. They appear to be an ancient, deeply isolated population whose ancestry splits away from other groups thousands of years before Alexander was even born. Their light eyes came from that same deep reservoir of ancient West Eurasian ancestry, the identical stream that carried the mutation eastward out of the steppe long before any empire rose. Their green eyes are not a keepsake from a famous conqueror. They are a living relic, preserved through mountain isolation so long that it outlasted every civilization people tried to credit it to. The legend nailed the drama and got the history wrong. The real story is quieter, older, and far more impressive. The Kailash are not alone. Travel through the mountain valleys of Central and South Asia, and you keep finding these same pockets in the Hunza Valley, in parts of Afghanistan, and across the highlands of Nuristan and Chitral, where green and light eyes show up far more often than you would expect. Each community works like a small time capsule, holding onto a genetic echo that arrived thousands of years ago and stayed locked in place, sheltered by mountains that kept the outside world at a distance. When you see a green-eyed child in one of these valleys, you are looking at the endpoint of one of the longest genetic journeys in human history. What makes these places so valuable to researchers is exactly how cut off they were. In a busy, well-connected region, a rare trait gets diluted and fades. But wall a community behind mountain passes, have people marry mostly within the group for centuries, and a trait that arrived long ago gets locked into place instead. It stops fading and starts concentrating. These remote valleys became accidental laboratories, preserving a slice of ancient ancestry the rest of the world blended away long ago. There is one face from this exact part of the world that most of the planet has already seen, even without knowing the science behind it. In the mid-1980s, a photojournalist captured a portrait of a young Afghan girl in a refugee camp, and her piercing green eyes ended up on the cover of one of the most widely read magazines in the world, becoming one of the most recognized images ever published. Part of why it hit so hard is simply that green eyes feel almost otherworldly. But the deeper explanation is the story we have been building this whole time. Those eyes were the visible surface of an invisible history, a mutation that began near the Black Sea, traveled east across the steppe, drifted down the Silk Road, and finally surfaced on the face of a child in the mountains of Central Asia. She was not an exception to this story. She was the story. So let's bring this back to you. If you are watching this with green eyes, what does it actually mean? It means you are carrying something genuinely ancient in your family line, reaching back further than any name your family tree records, further than any country that exists on a modern map. One of your ancestors picked up that original mutation, and against staggering odds, it made it through thousands of years of pure chance, through countless generations where it could have simply vanished. Every green-eyed person alive today is living proof that it did not. And here is the detail that catches almost everyone off guard. That mutation has zero respect for the borders we care so much about today. It does not care whether your family is European, Central Asian, or Middle Eastern. The same tiny genetic switch shows up in a fishing village in Denmark and in a mountain valley in Pakistan, in Turkey and in Ireland, in Afghanistan and in Scotland. Green eyes are one of the clearest reminders that the neat categories humans use to divide themselves are far younger and shallower than the DNA underneath them. A green-eyed woman in the Kalash Valley and a green-eyed man in rural Ireland are, in a very real sense, distant cousins, both carrying a gift from the same forgotten ancestor. This is also why a simple ancestry test can feel amazing and disappointing at once. It might hand you a tidy pie chart of regional percentages, but it rarely tells you the deeper story, the actual path your traits took to reach you. A test might flag some European ancestry and stop there, never mentioning that the exact same mutation sits quietly in mountain villages thousands of miles east, or that it all began with one person on the edge of Asia, long before Europe as we know it even existed. The percentages are just the surface. The real inheritance is the story buried underneath. Before we wrap up, a couple more details worth knowing. Since green eyes carry less melanin than brown ones, they let slightly more light through, which can make them a bit more sensitive to bright sunshine. That is not a flaw, just the same low pigment feature showing up in a different form. There is also ongoing research into possible links between eye color and other traits, though that science is still young, and you should be skeptical of anyone claiming your eye color shapes your personality. What we can say with confidence is the deep part, the ancestry and the migration, and that part of the story is remarkable enough on its own. One final detail. A huge number of green-eyed people were not actually born with green eyes at all. Plenty of babies arrive with grayish or bluish eyes because the melanin in their iris has not finished developing yet. Over the first several months, and sometimes the first couple of years, that pigment gradually fills in and the final color settles. A baby who starts out looking blue-eyed can slowly shift toward green as that thin layer of lipochrome finishes forming. In a very real sense, you can watch this ancient recipe finish cooking on a child's face, the final stretch of a journey that began thousands of years earlier on the shores of a sea most of us will never see.